I'm very pleased to be here and honoured to speak to you all. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the way we at Google look at user experience of products in emerging markets. As just mentioned, I'm Steve Rogers, Director of User Experience for Emerging Markets, and I've actually been leading UX teams working on internet projects since about 1994, 1995, so been in the business for a little while. I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes. Hopefully I'll leave just a minute or two for some questions at the end, and otherwise I'll be happy to speak to you in the break. So this is the mission that we set ourselves in user experience, to design a beautiful experience for the next billion users in emerging markets. And there's 2 points that I want to raise. The first is the next billion users. The next billion users will only come from emerging markets, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the first thing is to design a beautiful experience, because it's too easy to simply think that the product that you've built for elsewhere is going to simply work, and that's not always the case. So we do that looking at 3 things. The first is that we look to adapt the global products that we have and see if we can make those work better for people within emerging markets. The second is we look to inform design of new products, products which Google simply doesn't build elsewhere, which don't exist elsewhere, but which make sense in emerging markets. And hopefully through doing that, we look to build a sustainable UX practice, build knowledge that we can carry across into many other things. And I hope I'm going to show you a little bit about all of those 3 things. So first of all, let's talk about some numbers. Emerging markets, as far as Google is concerned, covers a very big chunk of the world. So we talk about Latin America, we talk about Africa, we talk about the Indian subcontinent, we talk about the Middle East, Malaysia, Indonesia. Now, that's 34 countries. We try to focus on 14 of those which make most sense, but it also covers about 1,000 different languages, which is a challenge in itself. Looking at internet penetration, we've got some interesting things happening with the colors here. I apologize for that. Half the world seems to be disappearing into grayscale, but never mind. If we look at internet penetration, then simply put, in the developed world, we are roughly at saturation point. Right? So you look at America, it's up at 70% plus. Look at Europe, it's kind of similar. If we look across emerging markets, that's not the case. But there are massive differences. If you look at Brazil here, for instance, internet penetration is already up at 50%, compared to India, where it's about 10%. Mobile phone penetration, on the other hand, is slightly different. There, it's getting to saturation across the whole globe. And one of the things that's interesting there, of course, is that at the moment, mobile phone penetration largely means feature phones. Sometimes those are internet enabled, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're really old legacy devices, sometimes they're actually really pretty capable things. One of the phones that you will know very well here is the Samsung Champ. Samsung Champ looks, frankly, much like a smartphone, but in industry terms, it's a feature phone because it runs on a Opera Mini browser or a native browser. What that means is that as those devices and smartphones start to become the norm, it will become more and more common that people will be accessing products through mobile and therefore will be connected in some way anyway. So if I look at the emerging markets design team, we're 11 different nationalities. We're at 8 locations across the globe. And one of the things that we like to do with that team is learn from one another. It's important that we have different nationalities so that we can learn from the experiences we all have. And it's important we're across the globe so that we can learn from our environment. And learning from our environment also means getting out into the field. So we've been doing a whole bunch of research projects, both explorative research, learning about basic business areas, learning about the way people behave in ethnographic terms, as well as specific product research, looking at sort of end usability of a product, taking a product that we're about to release, going and seeing if it actually works in the environment. Because you know what? You build something, you'll know this, you build something in a lab, you build something in a wonderful environment, you take it out to the field and try it, and it just simply breaks. And it doesn't just break technically, it breaks in terms of usability. Because if something takes 4 or 5 seconds in a great environment, you suddenly put that into an environment where it's going to take a minute, and it feels broken. So let's talk about a few things we've learned about our users, and then I'm going to look at our products. So the first thing is that both the users who are already online in emerging markets and those who are about to come online, if you like, the next 500 million to 1 billion people, share many of the same hurdles. There are some differences. So the existing emerging markets internet users tend to be what we would call early adopters. They tend to be urban, and they tend to be literate, or at least semi-literate in English. If we look at the users who are about to come online, then they tend to be less literate in English, but they're still urban or semi-urban, and they share the same hurdles of lack of infrastructure or poor infrastructure, poor connectivity, and they tend to have a social network which is either offline or on Facebook. Users in emerging markets are incredibly resourceful. This guy's an interesting case in point. This guy called Julius Jago. Now, Julius Jago recently won the gold medal in javelin in the 10th All-Africa Games. That's impressive in itself. It's even more impressive if you find out that he has no coach except YouTube. He couldn't find anyone to teach him how to throw a javelin in Kenya, so he simply went to YouTube and found all of the videos which could teach him how to do that, and then went ahead and won the gold medal. As this guy, who is a professor at, if I remember correctly, Ibadan University, and he realized that he wanted to get his message out to all of his students, even if they weren't at college. So he started to use Google Hangouts, and he now publishes all of his class materials on Google Plus and through Hangouts to get people up to speed even before they get to college. But all of these people have similar challenges. And that means we have similar challenges. We have to look at designing for limited resources. So generally users have limited finance, power's flaky, connectivity is flaky, transportation is a real issue to get to a place where they can get connected or get devices, and education is often fairly low level. All of those things mean people have a limited chance to connect. So what does that mean in terms of our opportunities? Now, one of the things that's interesting for us about emerging markets is that people don't have the same baggage of 20 years of experience of the internet. So if you look at somebody in America, then typically they started on a grotty old desktop. They've gone through possibly a laptop, and then they started to use WAP browsers on a phone, and now finally they're looking at smartphones and tablets. Well, in emerging markets, that just simply isn't the case. Most people go straight from a feature phone with actually a really current browser straight through to a smartphone or tablet, and occasionally a desktop in a cyber cafe. But it means that you don't carry the baggage with you. So what does that mean in terms of our products? And I'm going to look at a couple of the products that we've recently released. The first one is looking at a global product which we in the emerging markets team have adapted for use in emerging markets, and talk about why and how we've done that. And the second one is a product which we literally just released last week, which is specific for emerging markets. So the first is Google Plus on feature phones. Right, so Google Plus is known, Google Plus global product, that's great. If you put Google Plus on feature phones as it stands, and you simply try and run it on an Opera Mini browser, you will have a horrific experience for an awful lot of reasons. First is that, so before we completed this project, you wouldn't have been able to get a picture up on your profile. You wouldn't have been able to use a whole bunch of features. Signing up would have been a horrific experience in the first place. So we simply looked at all of the different things that were necessary, that were critical to make Google Plus a good and enjoyable user experience. So we realized that actually, you know what, there's not a lot of point building a profile if you can't put a picture of yourself. If you take Samsung Champ, it's got a really good camera, and it's got a 1.3 megapixel camera. You can get a really nice picture of yourself, and then we couldn't simply load it up through the phone onto the profile. That's because it's actually a really hard thing to do, as I'm sure any of you tried to do that will know. So the first thing we did was make sure that was possible, get the profile picture up onto the phone, make sure that circles work, and make sure that all of the features that you would want to use in Google Plus actually work decently on a feature phone and fast and lightweight, so that you're not simply sitting there waiting for ages and ages and ages. This project resulted in a massive increase in the number of shares, a massive increase in the number of users of Google Plus. So looking at that, we realized that actually smartphones were pretty badly served as well, as soon as people start to use Google Plus or a lot of other products through the browser rather than through a native app. Everyone in Europe, everyone in America tends to think that if they're going to use something like Google Plus or Facebook or so on, they'll do it through a native app if they're on a smartphone. The native app is really heavy, uses a lot of bandwidth, and we've seen that a lot of people, especially with an older operating system on a smartphone, is simply not going to do that. They're simply going to go straight through the browser and use that. Well, if you did that, you found that firstly, you were still using a lot of bandwidth, it was still slow, and it was a pretty grotty experience. So this is what it was before, and having then rebuilt it to be faster, lighter, simpler, we get to this experience, which even though you've suddenly got much bigger images, you've suddenly got a much more engaging experience, is still lighter and faster than the experience we had before. So then, the second project I wanted to run you through briefly is a project called BeiBePay. BeiBePay is a payment system based on an NFC card. So you simply get a free card. That's the initial pilot, and the current launch is in Kenya, in Nairobi. Initially on the transport system, but now rolling out to merchants. So any merchant can sign up for this system. You simply get a card which you load cash onto. It's an NFC card. All the merchant has to have is an Android device, and they simply use that, swipe the card, and then the cash is taken off, subtracted off the card, and the user is sent an SMS receipt. So why is that interesting? It's interesting because it makes a massive difference to the way people can budget and understand their business. It was such a big thing that when we launched it last week in Nairobi, the Deputy Prime Minister of Kenya came and launched the product himself, because he saw it making such a massive difference to the infrastructure of the company. And it's being rolled out through Equity Bank, who have 70% of all of the bank accounts in Kenya. So the reason it's valuable is it makes a difference to the way people transact. They no longer have to carry cash the whole time, which is dangerous and is potentially, they can lose it. As well as that, they can be ripped off. They can be ripped off easily in the buses. Simply put, the conductor will decide on the fare as the person gets on the bus. With this system, that's no longer the case, so they can budget. They know how much things are going to cost. What happens with the app is it looks like a calculator effectively. The conductor simply goes through, puts in all of the fares. Once it's uploaded, once the transaction is uploaded into the Android device, then it does not have to have ubiquitous connection. As soon as that device goes through an area where there's some connectivity, all the transactions are uploaded. So it means that it's fast, which is important, and it means that it's cheap for a merchant, because the only thing they've got to have is an Android device, not a sort of expensive point-of-sale machine, which is typical for credit cards or debit cards. And it means that both the merchant and the user suddenly have analytics. They know where they've spent their money, or they know how much money is coming in. And for people like the owners of the bus companies, this is really new. They actually know and they can plan on how much revenue they're going to get. This simply wasn't the case before. All they knew was that a bus would go out for the end of the day. The people who were controlling that bus would give them a certain amount of cash. They had no idea where it had come from, how it had come from, whether it was the right amount. Now they can track that. So lastly, I just want to talk about some of the principles that we work with. And these are principles that we've learned through speaking to a lot of people in a lot of countries. And every time we go out, every time we do either an explorative project, or we do a usability project, or we do a design project, participatory design project with people on the ground, we build on these principles. The first is one we call Expand My World. Everyone in the world now knows that there is a hell of a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of ways they can connect and a lot of things to get from this thing called the internet. What that means is they're no longer satisfied with simply having the information which is available locally, and they really want to participate. It doesn't matter if you're sitting in a tiny village in Africa, you know you can be part of the whole world, and that's really empowering. One size does not fit all. Now, I'm sure you'll recognize photos like this. This one isn't actually taken in India. It doesn't matter if you build a global product and make it available everywhere. People are incredibly resourceful. They'll simply make it work. It just won't necessarily work very well. So it's actually much better if you design something that's fit for purpose. Value for money. So in a lot of parts of the world, there's not a lot of money available, right? So what that means is that people think before they spend money. But the growth of mobile phones has shown that if there is true value in something, if it's actually worth somebody spending the money to get involved in an experience, they will do. So if we talk about a service which runs on the internet, which requires people to have data, then we better be sure that there is real value in it for them, because otherwise they'll spend it on something else. So one last thing to say is pursue universal aspirations. Now, this is a picture we often see, right, of Africa or some parts of the world. Save my life. Everyone has largely the same dreams, wishes, ambitions. But you know what? This isn't the only picture. The one we see much more often is this. Wherever we go, there is a tremendous amount of life, passion, excitement, and people really, really just want to have the energy to get involved. And that's, I think, the picture we see much more. Thank you.